It has to do with the time, and that is, of course, the centenary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. And so we were looking ahead to 2021. We had various meetings in 2018 and after, and we wanted to see what we could contribute as scholars that might offer an alternative to what you're going to get from Beijing and what you're going to get from the Western newspapers.
Yeah, and we were also, of course, fascinated by this story, right? It's a story of many metamorphoses. The Chinese Communist Party changes a lot of time. At times, it changes course. Its leadership changes, and we also thought that that's just it's a fascinating story, but also a very important story for today's readers to know.
I think that's right. I mean, on the one hand, I think in Beijing we're going to get sort of lots of celebrations about how the CCP has delivered China from whatever poverty and helped raise it again to become a great power and revived its culture. And these days in the West, it's predictable that there's going to be a lot of criticism of the CCP, and of course, rightly so. But I think what we could show is that this is a very complicated story. You begin with, a couple of bookish intellectuals in Shanghai in 1920, and 2 decades later, they are in charge in Beijing, and then do a lot of things. And now we are at a stage where China is reshaping the world, whether we like it or not, under the leadership of this particular party. So it's a story we need to know and we need to deal with. Our aim was really is to show the human side of this story through these individual histories. So rather than seeing it as a series of political decisions or struggles for power or this or that, we really wanted to bring out the individual side of that, of the party's history, what it means to live with, in, under, above the party, and sort of show that element. And I think it's the failure of approaching the party in that kind of way that helps explain at least some, you don't even hostility, so the ignorance about the party, which makes it so easy to be hostile about it.
One aspect here is probably also that obviously the Chinese Communist Party is one of the most powerful political organizations in the world, if not the most powerful organization in the world. And that obviously, of course, elicits, feelings of fear and and people, of course, are uncomfortable about it. Also, of course, the Communist Party is so many things that it has real difficulty explaining what it stands for and what it wants and what are its ambitions. Just look at the contemporary or current situation. It says it wants peaceful evolution, but it also, of course, invests heavily in the military. So there's always a discrepancy about what the party says and what it does. And I think that also fuels into hostility.
I think it's important to keep in mind, too, that the party for long periods of time actually was rather popular in Europe, especially, but also in the United States. It was popular because it was not the nationalists, which were a dictatorial regime and all that. In the 60s, in the 70s, when I went to university, a lot of people would have read Mao's book or would have not read Mao's book, but at least carried it in their pockets. And I said it was a real sort of Maoism was a real vogue.
Hans has a really good point, which is today's negative view of China in the West has not always been that way. And as Hans just said, in the 60s and the 70s, there was a really positive view of China. And so the Western views of China have been cyclical. They've gone up, they've gone down, they've been unrealistic in both senses. And they've thought China was too wonderful, then they think China's too horrible. And what basically is, as we see it, we project our hopes and fears onto China. And this little book tries to subvert that activity by putting a human face on each decade. Yeah. We don't really know how the party works very well, any of us. And it's the ignorance that's the problem. But we start with giving a sense of the diversity and change of the party as a beginning to break down that ignorance.
I think sort of we came to realize more and more as we read and developed these stories is that we can see sort of 4 phases in the history of the Chinese Communist Party, beginning with revolutionary youth in Shanghai, borrowing from a European or Moscow type Marxism. Then it transforms into a peasant revolution in the 1930s in China that ends up taking power. And that becomes an example to follow around the world, really. Very, very powerful. And then a phase after Mao, when there is a reform period. And then under Xi Jinping, more recently, what we call a sort of, we can see as a counter-reform period. So I think sort of that kind of schema of having 4 periods comes out in the book quite clearly.
From those 4 phases, we hope that this book, through the 10 lives that are presented, that readers can get some sense of the world that Xi Jinping is operating in, that Xi Jinping will make better sense. Because based on these stories, we can see how Xi Jinping is running a counter-reformation against the reforms of the Deng and Jiang Zemin period, which were a reaction to an earlier,
This is something where the party has also evolved, that this becomes an experience that's become, you know, much more commonplace, I think, for people in the party. As the party grew, it's become home to a lot of people, feel intensely. You know, they think the party is very personal to them. And I think that's also something to understand from our book.
I think the comparison to make there is like living with or within the Catholic Party, with Rome.
Yeah.
It's the same kinds of intensities of feelings.
Just think about this chapter by our Chinese colleague, Chang Tishun, you know, about this actor, a very female movie star. And even though she gets criticized, you know, and she gets expelled or is at this you know, almost expelled, she really wants to belong to the party, despite everything the party has done to her. And that's really something.
And a later chapter, one by the second of our Chinese-based authors, Xu Jilin, talks about an intellectual in the 1990s, Wang Yuanhua, and his reflections and critique of the party. And they're really quite substantive critiques, but they are the cri de coeur of as Hans was suggesting, it's his party. It's not right. It's like a Catholic criticism of the church. And that's why we think in terms of that metaphor is helpful for Westerners. The party is like a church. There's lots that the West can learn from the Chinese Communist Party, both positive and negative. And for those who know American politics, back to the 1990s, it's the vision thing. They sell a story that is broadly popular inside China, and that story is nationalism and 100 years of humiliation, and that the Communist Party has saved everything. The short version of the story that you will get from Xi Jinping is China stood up under Mao, got rich under Deng Xiaoping, and is getting strong under Xi Jinping. And that plays to the home market very well. The negative lesson is that control begets insecurity. The more you control, the more you have to manipulate, the more you need to do. This is an insecure government, despite the fact it's so powerful.
I mean, one of the things I think we should definitely not do is sort of underestimate some of the strengths of the party. And to me, it seems that also that there are cases in the book that I think can underline this, that the party has also been a learning organization. It learned from its mistakes, yeah, very systematically. It also looked at other cases in the world. It tried to learn from the Soviet Union, and they drew some clear conclusions from that. So this ability to learn from mistakes and failures and to change or reform its own ways, That is not necessarily the case with every party in the world, as we know very well.
To succeed in communist China today, the training that people go through, the knowledge that they accumulate, the experience that they accumulate is absolutely tremendous. And I'm always, when I talk to British officials or colleagues even at Cambridge who go to China, they are always impressed by how much they know about everything, including us. And the reverse cannot be said. What we know about China is very limited. I think if we're going to learn one thing, it is that we need to be much better at that, and that we need to take their governance models, not the negative sides of that, but where it is good, when what it has achieved in 3 decades of economic growth is actually spectacular. And there's one more point I'd like to add, and that is that, yes, the party controls, it's overly controlling, that is a weakness. But the party does know what lives at the local level, including by using modern AI technologies and social media. If I contrast that with the lack of knowledge, for instance, about what many people in the UK thought about inequality, thought about Europe, the dismissal of those concerns as just those of the uneducated, the deplorables, as Mrs. Clinton called them, that I don't think that would kind of attitude would get you very far in the Chinese Communist Party. That is definitely something to.
Yeah, so true. I think it was a very conscious decision, deliberate decision, not to have something on the big leaders, because our take on the party was to highlight, who is in a way the party below the big leaders, because we thought the party, gets its energy, its power, its mobilization power actually from the people on the ground. So we were interested more in the grassroots, the everyday experiences, the understanding what it means to be a party member, to make a career in the party, to fail in the party,